The best defense is the truth. Alison MacAdam wrote those words at the top of a Google Doc. She would look at them almost every day for 2 years. The 2 years she served as lead story editor on The 13th Step. That's New Hampshire Public Radio's investigation into sexual misconduct in the addiction treatment industry. It was Sigmund Schutz, the team's lawyer, who had said those words, although they're hardly original. What Alison couldn't have known when she first took on this project was just how important that phrase would seem later, after this happened to her colleague, 13th Step reporter Lauren Chooljian.
Someone had thrown a rock through my parents' basement window, shattered almost the entire thing. And when she and my dad went outside to see the damage, that's when they saw the garage doors. On one of my parents' bright white garage doors, someone had spray painted the C word. The second garage door just had a letter C on it, like someone started to write it again but stopped.
In that moment, this story about sexual misconduct would also become something more, a series that has a lot to say about freedom of the press. And in early May, only 2 days ago, it would win a Pulitzer nomination. Welcome to part 2 of how to find the truth behind the blockbuster investigative series, The 13th Step. This is Sound Judgment, where we investigate just what it takes to become a beloved audio storyteller by pulling apart one episode at a time together. I'm Elaine Appleton Grant. Before I jump in, it's been a long time since I introduced myself. You may know me as the woman who's so obsessed with storytelling that I can't stop myself from breaking it down with the best audio storytellers working today. But you may not know what I do when I'm not making Sound Judgment. I run Podcast Allies, a consulting and training company for people and organizations who tell stories to connect, no matter the platform. I consult with mission-driven leaders on podcast strategy and with media organizations on show development and redevelopment. I also speak at conferences and offer a variety of coaching and workshops in effective storytelling, like the art of the interview and how to tap your own identity and talents to engage your audience and keep them coming back. More than anything, I love community based on ideas and great storytelling. If you're listening to Sound Judgment right now, you're my kind of person. A great way to connect with me is to subscribe to my newsletter, Sound Judgment, on Substack. I'll put that link and the link to Podcast Allies in the show notes. Welcome to the Sound Judgment community. Become a better storyteller in audio and beyond. In case you haven't yet listened to part 1, here's a very brief recap and a caveat. You might want to stop this right now and go listen to part 1 first. In December of 2020, Lauren Chooljian got an email. She'd reported a story or two about a COVID outbreak at an addiction treatment center owned by a guy named Eric Spofford. The email she got was about him.
It essentially said, "You think that's bad?" The email was from a clinician at the company's flagship treatment facility called Green Mountain Treatment Center. And this clinician made a huge allegation. She said that the guy who founded and ran that treatment center, he was sexually abusing female clients and employees.
So she started calling around. And those calls, well, they led to a 3-year reporting journey, some life-changing, terrifying moments, a passionate conviction about the importance of press freedom, and a slew of awards given because this would be journalism for the public good. In part 1, I concentrated a lot on the process by which Lauren and Alison and their team, which included reporter Jason Moon, framed the central question of the 13th Step. How could so many people be harmed in an industry dedicated to healing? In this episode, we'll learn 2 big lessons. 1, how to make interesting storytelling choices when you're creating a complex narrative series or a long-form story on any platform out of mountains of material. And 2, how to conduct your reporting, writing, and editing so that no one can call its honesty into question, so that no one can prove that it is false. Not in the court of public opinion, and not in a courtroom. Let's start with the second lesson I mentioned, how to find the truth and prove yourself truthful at every step along the way. I want to start with something basic, and that is how we think about transparency. Of course, it means explaining your process, how you learn the facts of what you're presenting, sharing evidence. But it also means presenting a three-dimensional, nuanced picture of the person at the heart of the investigation, a thorough portrait of a complex human being. That might seem obvious, but as a longtime editor, I've seen and heard a lot of stories where you can tell the journalist made up their mind before they started writing. Two-dimensional stories aren't just dishonest, they're not credible, and often they get boring fast. So let's listen to how to do this well. This passage comes from the beginning of episode 2, The God of Recovery. Right off the bat, we become aware of a contradiction, a mystery.
Eric Spofford knows how to get people's attention. He founded a wildly successful addiction treatment company in New Hampshire. It's called Granite Recovery Centers, and Eric built it on a story, his story. For a while, there was a big picture of his face on the website, next to some text that said, "Where you're going, I've been." That's because Eric's story is about overcoming addiction and then turning around and guiding other people toward recovery. Eric, you'll remember, is the guy with the helicopter. He's also the guy who allegedly sexually harassed his former client on Snapchat. The guy who was described by another woman as the God of Recovery. This is the same woman who told me Eric had 13th stepping, quote, down to a science. And there are more women I've heard from. We'll get to that. How do we square these two characters? A man devoted to inspiring and healing others, and a man accused of abusing his power, especially with women.
We ask the listener to kind of hold those, multiple versions of Eric in their mind as they learn all this information, because that is the experience, as I was told from sources, of knowing him and, learning recovery from him or working with him, that there's this public version of Eric that still today is one of wealth and authority and, I know how to do business well and you should learn it from me. I know how to do recovery well. You should learn it from me. But then there's this other picture of Eric that we learn from people who say they've been harmed by him. And all of those images come together to give you the full picture, I think. And so that's kind of what we wanted people to experience. It's one of those things where it's like the allegations of sexual misconduct are true, and the stories people tell about how powerful Eric was in their life, also true. There are people who to this day say that Eric Spofford is the reason that they are sober. Mm-hmm. And there are also people like Elizabeth and Employee A and the people who spoke to Employee B who say that man harmed them. We needed people to know about all Eric, that's also what's fair to him. And that's why we, go to great lengths to be transparent about statements he would give us or responses he would have to the allegations. We should say when we've gone to him multiple times, he or his lawyers have always said that all these allegations aren't true. Transparency works in all ways. And so we wanted to be open about everything we knew about Eric Spofford.
Here's story editor Alison MacAdam.
I think, one of the bigger themes of sexual misconduct and, the Me Too movement is that a lot of these people are abusing their power that they really won by achieving things and in some cases doing really good things. And that is a core reason that it can be so hard to expose abusers. And if we had just presented a bunch of bad things, I don't think it would have made sense when we said that somebody was, afraid to report or didn't want to tell their story or, because you need to understand that people genuinely felt that they owed something to him.
Right. And why he was so powerful or terrifying to them is, this public persona that he had and this access to the governor. That was intimidating to a lot of sources. I mean, that was sometimes like the first or second thing out of someone's mouth on the phone was like, well, he knows the governor, right? So, those are the things that inform people's fear of retaliation. And so those are also the things that listeners needed to learn about Eric.
People were afraid that this wealthy, powerful man, a friend of the governor, remember, would retaliate if they spoke up. And it would turn out later for good reason.
I am so filled with anxiety. I'm filled with fear.
Sorry for the no contact. Can we check in tomorrow and maybe connect then? I'm just overly anxious and stressed about it all.
He has money. He has lawyers.
His power and money is intimidating to me, and I don't want to end up in a courtroom.
I'm honestly thinking that I'm no longer going to share my name.
I honestly don't want to be involved anymore.
With everything that my family is going through right now,
I just don't want to be a part of it.
I want to take my statements away about Eric.
This is a small window into what it's like to report on sexual misconduct. These are words that multiple women said or texted to me, but those aren't their real voices. I got their permission to share even the most basic sentences with you in ways that are unidentifiable, because it's the best way I know to illustrate something that happens all the time in every industry, not just addiction treatment. People work up the courage to contact a reporter because they want accountability, closure, justice. But then they consider all the very real downsides.
Obviously, this kind of reporting is delicate. It requires patience and understanding. Sometimes people don't call back, sometimes they reach out and want to talk, only to change their minds later. Other times they'll prefer anonymity for their own protection, like the woman Lauren called Elizabeth. But anonymous sources are tricky. On the one hand, you have a source who you're already asking to talk about some of their most painful experiences, who's scared. Lauren and any humane reporter wants and needs to protect them. On the other hand, audiences can wonder whether to trust the word of anonymous sources. There are solutions, of course. It's just good journalistic practice to be absolutely positive that everything you report is backed up by evidence. Saying so at every turn helps build trust with the audience. It helps build trust with future sources, and it serves as a kind of inoculation against legal retaliation. And so I want you to notice something. How often the word corroborate comes up in this series.
And so we needed people to know that, listen, when we put something out, it's rock solid, it's been corroborated.
That employee A says Eric forced her to have sex in his office. I also corroborated employee A's story. This is how reporting on sexual misconduct works. In employee A's case, I talked with 3 separate people who all said employee A told what even is direct personal knowledge. I had reported what peers told me and corroborated it with other people. He'd heard rumors about Eric's behavior.
But I also didn't know how to tell him no.
I corroborated what employee A told me with other sources, but Eric denies that it happened. The Snapchats, everything. I was able to corroborate this with a friend employee A told about this meeting. And the FBI agent, employee A says, didn't seem surprised by her story.
So let's go back in time now to March 2022. NHPR has just published Lauren's first long story about the allegations against Eric Spofford. And it's here that things start to get crazy. Here's a clip from the 3rd episode of The 13th Step.
About a month after the story came out, so late April 2022, I was on vacation with my husband and my daughter. We were figuring out what to make for breakfast when this weird text came in from my mom. It said, "Any chance Matt," that's my husband, "any chance Matt would have a few minutes to talk to Dad about a security camera? Sadly, we had something happen at the house last night and need one." I obviously called her right away. And my mom told me that morning she woke up suddenly and realized it felt really cold in the house. She went downstairs to check it out, and she saw glass all over the floor. Someone had thrown a rock through my parents' basement window, shattered almost the entire thing. And when she and my dad went outside to see the damage, that's when they saw the garage doors. On one of my parents' bright white garage doors, Someone had spray painted the C word. The second garage door just had a letter C on it, like someone started to write it again but stopped. I immediately thought, this had to be in response to my reporting. I told her, Mom, I know what this is.
But then Lauren would discover that it wasn't only her parents' house. Her news director, Dan Barrick, his house had been vandalized too, the same night, the same way.
Both Dan and my mother and my dad had both thought to themselves, what a crazy situation. Some teenager must have just done this. They had never thought, that it must be in response to the reporting. But for me, who had heard from so many terrified sources, I thought, this is a serious story, and people said to be afraid. Now, I had no clue who did it or who told someone to do it or what entailed, but it felt to me that it must be related. We then end up hearing there was a third house where I used to live that was also vandalized that night, which was just unbelievable. A month after that, actually, it was when my house was vandalized with the words "just the beginning" spray painted in red spray paint on my house, right underneath a window that a brick was thrown through and smashed. And my parents' house was hit again.
All this was happening as Lauren was still reporting the story. And now, Lauren would be faced with a decision she had never had to contemplate before. Previously, she'd been reporting on the experiences of others. Would she now have to, in effect, report on herself?
There were a lot of editorial decisions that went into what to include and not to include. But I think the bottom line was why we decided to include my experience was because it just underscored this larger theme of how difficult it is to come forward with an allegation of sexual misconduct, especially in the addiction treatment industry, where the power dynamics can be so big. And, that was retaliation. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Local law enforcement in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, that's where Lauren lived, began investigating the attacks. In 2023, 4 men were arrested and charged with federal crimes. By April 2024, 2 had pled guilty.
3 of them were the ones who threw the bricks and did the spray paint, and a 4th named Eric Labarge, who is a really close friend of Eric Spofford, the feds say is the one who paid these guys and ordered the hits on our houses.
Spofford himself has faced no charges and denies any involvement. So I know you've talked about this a lot. It's the thing probably that people ask you about the most because it's so shocking and frankly so terrifying. What was your initial reaction when you first talked to your parents? I just imagine that this must have been pretty alarming. And particularly, when you worry about family members, they didn't ask to be in this story. They didn't ask to be a part of this.
I mean, it wasn't great. I wasn't home both of these times. And so I wasn't with my team. So it felt really isolating. And I think it felt really scary, of course, but more, it was immediately pretty clear that this was so much bigger than me, that this was an act to shut down reporting that someone didn't like. And, I want to be really clear that I didn't at the time know who that someone was, but that this was shutting down reporting. This was a First Amendment situation. This was a what kind of world are we living in now situation. And that to me was terrifying. But I also felt so deeply for my family. I kind of don't love the idea that they didn't ask to be in this or they, because my family is my team and Alison is now my family. None of us asked for anything to happen to us, but we all believe so strongly in this reporting. And even though there were moments when my parents were so terrified that they asked me not to go forward with anymore, they did that out of care and concern for all of us. They didn't want anything bad to happen. And I just couldn't believe that we were in a situation where we had to take those things into consideration. I just think that after many, many, many now years of like therapy and talking about it, I think my takeaway is that, and it had been at that time too, that like the reporting is so much bigger than this situation. And for so many of the people involved in this reporting, like they didn't have easy access to a lawyer. They didn't have a insurance situation like we have at the station. They didn't have a CEO who could like call a security company to send them to my house. Like, and yet they did such a big deal thing of coming forward and talking to a stranger and saying, hey, something happened to me. And so like I had to continue and we had to continue. And it was the total right thing to do to continue. You know, the feelings at the outset are, of course, important human feelings, but the feelings were also there of like, this will go on.
Like Lauren said, this situation was so much bigger than her. I wanted to understand, as best I could, how station leadership responded. And are there lessons here for other general managers and CEOs? Should all news leaders now be preparing just-in-case responses, not just to potential retaliation in court, but retaliation with things like bricks, spray paint, or worse? I worked at New Hampshire Public Radio, I should say that. And so I just have utmost respect for the station. And your president has a background as a news executive. Like he's an editorial guy. He didn't come up the ranks on the business side. He understands journalism. Is it possible that if you had been reporting this story for a different station, a different publication, in this time where, you know, First Amendment is under attack, that perhaps you wouldn't have had the same level of support? Or is that just too speculative? Like you can't really tell?
Yeah, I can't answer that. What I do know is that it would have been totally reasonable for NHPR to say, look, like, you know, let's not go forward. But that's not what it ever was. It was, how do we protect our team? And how do we finish the job? And, you know, I think I want to also say credit to NHPR for asking me what I wanted to do at every step of the way. And that means, you know, Alison asking me, is this okay to put this tape of you crying in the podcast? And that means Jason asking me, like, do you need a hug after like having a really hard interview? And that means Jim saying, you know, how many nights do you want security at your house? And so
Jim Schachter, the president of NHPR.
Right. And so I think, you know, I can't speak to what other newsrooms can do. And I don't want to say that like, you know, overspending or not spending, you know, I don't make those. I do a particular job. It's called reporter, and I'm going to stick with that. But I want to say that, you know, I'm happy to talk to anybody in any other newsroom, and I have been, about the ways that we made this work, because this reporting is so essential for so many reasons. And I don't want other newsrooms to feel like they can't pull this stuff off when it feels like the going is getting too tough, because somehow we were able to pull it off ourselves.
At this point, I've left out something else that happened that made all of this even harder to deal with. In September 2022, Eric Spofford filed a lawsuit against the station, Lauren, news director Dan Barrick, and 3 of her sources. In it, he called Lauren's March 2022 story a, quote, hit piece about Eric. The suit claimed that the article and the podcast made false claims and that everyone named in the suit knew it. You can read the complaint on the 13th Step website. There would be many actions back and forth between the station and Eric Spofford. NHPR's legal team filed a motion for dismissal, and initially the judge agreed, but
Eric was not done fighting. He and his lawyers argued that they needed to see all of our reporting materials because without gaining access to my notes and interviews, they said they wouldn't be able to sufficiently allege that I had defamed Eric. That's as far as things had progressed by episode 6. But then, the judge dropped a big order that seemed to be his version of a compromise. Judge Daniel St. Hilaire said that he wanted to see my reporting materials. He ordered what's known as an in-camera review. The judge would look at my notes and interview transcripts privately, and he would decide if there was anything in there that Eric should be allowed to see.
This would be a tough decision. Even though only the judge would see Lauren's background reporting materials, all 3,000 pages, Lauren worried that turning it over would make future sources even more nervous to come forward. But in the end, NHPR turned over Lauren's materials. Which brings up once again how to report defensively, as if at any point you could be sued and your sources could be intimidated or sued. The methods for a reporting team aren't any different than we've already talked about, doing the painstaking work of corroborating every story, every statement, with at least 2 other sources, checking every fact, sharing your reporting process and the evidence, and stating every response from the people you're investigating. As I said, NHPR would put many pieces of evidence and legal documents on their website for everyone to see. Oh, and of course, having a good legal team in place matters. One note about this: the need for legal help is more and more important in this journalistic environment where the odds of some kind of retaliation seem to be growing. And that means that media outlets can be skittish about taking on worthwhile but legally risky projects unless creators, including independent ones, put lawyers on their teams. Lawyers who, in many cases, independent journalists can't afford. Neither can some media outlets. That's just one piece of a retaliatory environment that contributes to chilling important stories. I don't have an answer for it. I'd really like to hear from people who do. But let's go back to the actual storytelling choices for a minute. As I mentioned, it's against this backdrop, 2 rounds of vandalism and a lawsuit, that Lauren and the team keep reporting. Here they are, mired in the story of the allegations against Eric Spofford, and they make an interesting narrative choice. There were 2 points along the way in this series where you depart from Eric's story pretty significantly. Episode 4, where you broaden out to say, well, what's going on with the system? How is it supposed to work?
And pretty quickly, I realized my specific question, how Eric Spofford got away with alleged sexual misconduct, was tightly wound up with a much bigger question. How does anyone get away with unethical behavior in the addiction treatment industry?
And then episode 5, where you actually report on an entirely different story in Southern California.
This is The 13th Step. I'm Lauren Chooljian. And by the end of this episode, 2 women are going to catch a bad guy. A guy who was a big deal in addiction treatment in Southern California. So far in this podcast, we've learned a lot about why that often does not happen. So I was really curious to hear about this guy named Chris Batham. He was the owner and CEO of a substance use disorder treatment company in Los Angeles. He called himself the rehab mogul, and he will likely be in prison for the rest of his life for sexual assault and insurance fraud.
Those are big choices in a narrative arc because they don't just follow naturally, right? Like you have to say, well, maybe we should do this here. So talk to me about one or both of those choices.
Yeah, I mean, I think we knew all along, and even before we published the original story, we knew that we wanted to dig into the history of addiction treatment as an industry and how it worked and how it had come to be the way that it was. You know, there were points at which we thought there was going to be an entire episode simply on the history, and I think it became about 3 lines in episode 4. But I think it was really important to us that we dig into that because it's a natural question that you have as you're listening. If we're asking this question about how could this industry harm people, we have to at least take a swing at understanding the nature and the culture of the industry. And I think we needed to sort of get our primary story out before we did that. You know, really roughly speaking, if episodes 1 and 2 are sort of air the original reporting and broader themes and background, episode 3 really digs into this broader theme of sexual misconduct and the risks of reporting sexual misconduct. And then episode 4 was going to dig into this broader question about how addiction treatment actually works as an industry. And it was a really hard episode to make. It's sort of wonkier than the other episodes. There were a million different directions that we could have taken it. And then episode 5, I think, speaking again to this issue of how you make this a valuable listening experience for listeners that isn't just all dark and awful and traumatic. One great way for us to answer this question of how Eric Spofford got away with it was to tell the story of how someone else finally, although it took years and years, didn't get away with it. We knew that Eric Spofford's story was unfinished. No one has, filed a police report for, sexual assault, for example, against him. But this was a story that was its own finished story where the whole process had occurred. And it was really also revealing about how hard it was. But it also, it has, I guess, a happy ending. And you need some happy endings in stories like this, if you can find them.
Happy endings. For NHPR, for Lauren, there would be one. In December 2023, Judge Daniel St. Hilaire threw out Spofford's lawsuit. Lauren reports this in the most recent episode. Update, a new bill, and a final ruling.
Judge Daniel St. Hilaire issued an order, his takeaways from reading through my reporting. I'm going to read some of it to you. Here in conducting the in-camera review, the court found no indication that Chooljian or the other NHPR defendants possessed knowledge that their reporting was false, acted with reckless disregard of its falsity, or entertained doubts as to the truth of their publication. And then he goes on to add, quote, on the contrary, Spofford's assertion of actual malice has no merit as compared to the depth, detail, and accuracy of Chooljian's investigation as reviewed by the court.
As it always is, the best defense is the truth. At the end of my interviews with people, I always do a little lightning round. So are you willing to do a little lightning round with me?
I'm ready.
All right.
Okay.
Let me start with you, Alison. How has working on the 13th step changed you in a way that you didn't expect?
In lightning round.
Yeah.
Well, Elaine.
All right, make fun of me. Go ahead.
I think I've learned a lot more about trauma-informed journalism and also trauma-informed collaboration with my colleagues. Working with a team that is, really struggling with their own stuff for very good reason while trying to keep moving forward. We really learned a lot about how to work together in that kind of setting. And I don't think, anyone would desperately want to go back to that situation again. But I think we did the absolute best we could at a time when it was really hard for it just to kind of work sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
Yeah.
there you go.
Lauren, how about you? If you had to say one way in which reporting this very traumatic, very well done series changed you in a way that you didn't expect, what would that be?
I think it really extended my skills as an interviewer to be more trauma informed. I like to think that I was pretty aware of what sources bring to the table as much as one can. But now I feel like I've really leveled up in that department, not just because of my own experience of trauma, but what all I've learned along the way, source management and different things to ask or different things to make more time for. That's one big takeaway. But, I think I'm with Alison too. We all learned a lot about how to create and sustain a trauma-informed workplace, which I think, is really hard to maintain. And we worked really, really hard at it because we care so much about each other. Mm-hmm. And I say hard to maintain because sometimes we all just want to get the work done and we're all very motivated and we all work really hard and we'll work all night and all day. And, sometimes taking breaks and giving each other space is the best way to heal and move forward. And it's hard to be like, okay, I guess I'm not going to work on that right now. I need to take a breather. And so I think starting to prioritize taking care of ourselves in this process was a big thing that I took away, and that, I'm certainly going to apply to projects in the future.
And you mentioned before, Lauren, that you could talk about how your therapist got involved. Is there like a short thing that you can say about that?
Yeah. So when all this was going down at my own house and my parents' house, I'm very open that I've been seeing therapists for a good chunk of my life, but it was time to level up in the therapy department. And so I came into contact with a therapist who specializes in trauma and PTSD. And I think something that she offered to all of us was to get on a Zoom call. And she gave us basically like a mini lecture about how trauma affects the brain and how that can affect systems. And she just gave us this really helpful shared language for what was happening to all of us. Like, it didn't matter if it was your house or if it was your colleague or if you lived in New Hampshire or Massachusetts or DC or whatever. Like, this was affecting all of us. And here's how we were going to all work through it and talk about it. One especially helpful thing that she gave us was we should start off any feedback session with a check-in. And especially for me, if I was coming to an edit and it was like episode 3 where we're now going to edit my personal experience, that someone would have to say, hey, Lauren, like, how are you? And I would say exactly how I was feeling. And that person would have to repeat back to me, I hear you say you're feeling X, Y, and Z. And so that would be validating that I've heard someone say how I felt. And then they would add, but I want you to know you're doing a great job. And Naomi taught us that, like, somehow in the depths of your brain, that kind of just brings it down a notch and allows you to be a touch more present and a little less, with your back up, waiting for something bad to happen. And that has been a great tool for all of us, and is one that I give free of charge to anybody who needs it, because it really has been so, so helpful for us.
At the end of every episode, I give you some of my takeaways. Here are a few of today's. 1. In today's journalistic and political environment, the best defense is the truth. That means using every reporting strategy you have to make sure all of your reporting is factual, precise, backed up with evidence, and well organized. 2. Corroborate. Then show in your reporting that you corroborated your facts and how. 3. Transparency is key. Paint thorough, fair portraits of your subjects. Many people credit Eric Spofford with helping them heal from addiction and even saving their lives. Others claim that he abused his power. Human beings are complex and contradictory. That tension makes for interesting stories and aids credibility. 4. Newsroom leadership needs to be as committed to your journalism as you are. Depending on the circumstances, they may need to pay legal fees, tap insurance, and even fund security. 5. Lauren had 2 huge reasons to continue reporting the 13th step in the face of criminal threats. The first, because her sources had bravely stepped forward to share their stories with her, and that put them at risk without the kinds of resources that protected Lauren. And 2, because backing down would send a signal to others that these kinds of threats work. That's unacceptable. That's all for today. Thanks for being with me on my deep dive into the 13th step. Huge thanks to Lauren Chooljian and Alison MacAdam for going behind the scenes with me and for helping me to fact-check this story and related articles. You've spent a lot of precious time on this project, and I appreciate it. And congratulations to you and the rest of the NHPR team on your Pulitzer nomination. And a bit of personal news. This is the 50th episode of Sound Judgment and the last one of this season. I'm putting the show on hiatus for the rest of the spring and the summer. During this hiatus, please check out our back catalog and share your favorite episodes with friends and colleagues. If you're not sure where to start, check out our new listener guides on soundjudgmentpodcast.com. While I take a break from producing new episodes, I'll be doing more coaching, consulting, speaking, and teaching, and squeezing in some time off. After 2 years of analyzing other people's stories, I also plan to report some stories of my own. I'm so grateful to every one of you for listening, for writing reviews on Apple Podcasts, and rating the show on Spotify, for sharing it with friends and in your newsletters. My Sound Judgment newsletter will continue as usual, so please sign up for it on Substack. The link's in the show notes at soundjudgmentpodcast.com. And please stay in touch. I love hearing from you. My email is on the website, or you can reach me through my newsletter or on LinkedIn. Finally, this is a heartfelt goodbye and bucket loads of gratitude to Tina Basir. For the last 3 years, she's been working as operations and marketing manager at Podcast Allies, but she's truly been so much more than that. She's been my partner in growing the business and this podcast, and I couldn't have done either without her. I'm truly one of the luckiest entrepreneurs around to have found the perfect person to work with all this time. Your new employer has no idea how lucky they are to have you. Congratulations. Sound Judgment is sponsored by Podcast Allies, LLC, a consulting and training company that helps you become a better storyteller in audio and beyond. Thanks to Tina Basir for podcast management, Audrey Nelson for production assistance, and Kevin Klein for audio engineering. Sound Judgment is produced by me, Elaine Appleton Grant.